Sojourn in England and return to India of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi took his studies seriously and tried to brush up on his English and Latin by taking the University of London matriculation examination. But, during the 3 years he spent in England, his main preoccupation was with personal and moral issues rather than with academic ambitions. The transition from the half-rural atmosphere of Reykjavik to the cosmopolitan life of London was not easy for him. As he struggled painfully to adapt himself to Western food, dress, and etiquette, he felt awkward. His vegetarianism became a continual source of embarrassment to him. His friends warned him that it would wreck his studies as well as his health. Fortunately for him, he came across a vegetarian restaurant as well as a book providing a reasoned defense of vegetarianism, which henceforth became a matter of conviction for him, not merely a legacy of his Vaishnava background. The missionary zeal he developed for vegetarianism helped to draw the pitifully shy youth out of his shell and gave him a new poise. He became a member of the executive committee of the London Vegetarian Society, attending its conferences and contributing articles to its journal. In the boarding houses and vegetarian restaurants of England, Gandhi met not only food faddists but some earnest men and women to whom he owed his introduction to the Bible and, more important, the Bhagavad Gita, which he read for the first time in its English translation by Sir Edwin Arnold. The Bhagavad Gita, commonly known as the Gita, is part of the great epic the Mahabharata and, in the form of a philosophical poem, is the most popular expression of Hinduism. The English vegetarians were a motley crowd. They included socialists and humanitarians such as Edward Carpenter, the British Thoreau, Fabians such as George Bernard Shaw, and theosophists such as Annie Besant. Most of them were idealists. Quite a few were rebels who rejected the prevailing values of the late Victorian establishment, denounced the evils of the capitalist and industrial society, preached the cult of the simple life, and stressed the superiority of moral over material values and of cooperation over conflict. Those ideas were to contribute substantially to the shaping of Gandhi's personality and, eventually, to his politics. Painful surprises were in store for Gandhi when he returned to India in July 1891. His mother had died in his absence, and he discovered to his dismay that the barrister's degree was not a guarantee of a lucrative career. The legal profession was already beginning to be overcrowded, and Gandhi was much too diffident to elbow his way into it. In the very first brief he argued in a court in Bombay, now Mumbai, he cut a sorry figure. Turned down even for the part-time job of a teacher in a Bombay high school, he returned to Reykjavik to make a modest living by drafting petitions for litigants. Even that employment was closed to him when he incurred the displeasure of a local British officer. It was, therefore, with some relief that in 1893 he accepted the none too attractive offer of a year's contract from an Indian firm in Natal, South Africa. Years in South Africa. Africa was to present to Gandhi challenges and opportunities that he could hardly have conceived. In the end he would spend more than 2 decades there, returning to India only briefly in 1896 to 97. The youngest 2 of his 4 children were born there. Emergence as a political and social activist. Gandhi was quickly exposed to the racial discrimination practiced in South Africa. In a Durban court he was asked by the European magistrate to take off his turban. He refused and left the courtroom. A few days later, while traveling to Pretoria, he was unceremoniously thrown out of a first-class railway compartment and left shivering and brooding at the rail station in Pietermaritzburg. In the further course of that journey, he was beaten up by the white driver of a stagecoach because he would not travel on the footboard to make room for a European passenger. And finally he was barred from hotels reserved for Europeans only. Those humiliations were the daily lot of Indian traders and laborers in Natal, who had learned to pocket them with the same resignation with which they pocketed their meager earnings. What was new was not Gandhi's experience but his reaction. He had so far not been conspicuous for self-assertion or aggressiveness. But something happened to him as he smarted under the insults heaped upon him. In retrospect, the journey from Durban to Pretoria struck him as one of the most creative experiences of his life. It was his moment of truth. Henceforth he would not accept injustice as part of the natural or unnatural order in South Africa. He would defend his dignity as an Indian and as a man. While in Pretoria, Gandhi studied the conditions in which his fellow South Asians in South Africa lived and tried to educate them on their rights and duties, but he had no intention of staying on in South Africa. Indeed, in June 1894, as his year's contract drew to a close, he was back in Durban, ready to sail for India. At a farewell party given in his honor, he happened to glance through the Natal Mercury and learned that the Natal Legislative Assembly was considering a bill to deprive Indians of the right to vote. "This is the first nail in our coffin," Gandhi told his hosts. They professed their inability to oppose the bill, and indeed their ignorance of the politics of the colony, and begged him to take up the fight on their behalf. Until the age of 18, Gandhi had hardly ever read a newspaper. Neither as a student in England nor as a budding barrister in India had he evinced much interest in politics. Indeed, he was overcome by a terrifying stage fright whenever he stood up to read a speech at a social gathering or to defend a client in court. Nevertheless, in July 1894, when he was barely 25, he blossomed almost overnight into a proficient political campaigner. He drafted petitions to the Natal legislature and the British government and had them signed by hundreds of his compatriots. He could not prevent the passage of the bill but succeeded in drawing the attention of the public and the press in Natal, India, and England to the Natal Indians' grievances. He was persuaded to settle down in Durban to practice law and to organize the Indian community. In 1894 he founded the Natal Indian Congress, of which he himself became the indefatigable secretary. Through that common political organization, he infused a spirit of solidarity in the heterogeneous Indian community. He flooded the government, the legislature, and the press with closely reasoned statements of Indian grievances. Finally, he exposed to the view of the outside world the skeleton in the imperial cupboard, the discrimination practiced against the Indian subjects of Queen Victoria in one of her own colonies in Africa. It was a measure of his success as a publicist that such important newspapers as the Times of London and the Statesman and Englishman of Calcutta, now Kolkata, editorially commented on the Natal Indians' grievances. In 1896 Gandhi went to India to fetch his wife, Kasturba, or Kasturba, and their two oldest children and to canvass support for the Indians overseas. He met prominent leaders and persuaded them to address public meetings in the country's principal cities. Unfortunately for him, garbled versions of his activities and utterances reached Natal and inflamed its European population. On landing at Durban in January 1897, he was assaulted and nearly lynched by a white mob. Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary in the British cabinet, cabled the government of Natal to bring the guilty men to book, but Gandhi refused to prosecute his assailants. It was, he said, a principle with him not to seek redress of a personal wrong in a court of law. Gandhi was not the man to nurse a grudge. On the outbreak of the South African Boer War in 1899, he argued that the Indians, who claimed the full rights of citizenship in the British Crown colony of Natal, were in duty bound to defend it. He raised an ambulance corps of 1,100 volunteers, out of whom 300 were free Indians and the rest indentured laborers. It was a motley crowd, barristers and accountants, artisans and laborers. It was Gandhi's task to instill in them a spirit of service to those whom they regarded as their oppressors. The editor of the Pretoria News offered an insightful portrait of Gandhi in the battle zone. The British victory in the war brought little relief to the Indians in South Africa. The new regime in South Africa was to blossom into a partnership, but only between Boers and Britons. Gandhi saw that, with the exception of a few Christian missionaries and youthful idealists, he had been unable to make a perceptible impression upon the South African Europeans. In 1906 the Transvaal government published a particularly humiliating ordinance for the registration of its Indian population. The Indians held a mass protest meeting at Johannesburg in September 1906 and, under Gandhi's leadership, took a pledge to defy the ordinance if it became law in the teeth of their opposition and to suffer all the penalties resulting from their defiance. Thus was born satyagraha, devotion to truth, a new technique for redressing wrongs through inviting, rather than inflicting, suffering, for resisting adversaries without rancor and fighting them without violence. The struggle in South Africa lasted for more than 7 years. It had its ups and downs, but under Gandhi's leadership, the small Indian minority kept up its resistance against heavy odds. Hundreds of Indians chose to sacrifice their livelihood and liberty rather than submit to laws repugnant to their conscience and self-respect. In the final phase of the movement in 1913, hundreds of Indians, including women, went to jail, and thousands of Indian workers who had struck work in the mines bravely faced imprisonment, flogging, and even shooting. It was a terrible ordeal for the Indians, but it was also the worst possible advertisement for the South African government, which, under pressure from the governments of Britain and India, accepted a compromise negotiated by Gandhi on the one hand and the South African statesman General Jan Christian Smuts on the other. "The saint has left our shores," Smuts wrote to a friend on Gandhi's departure from South Africa for India, in July 1914, "I hope forever." A quarter-century later, he wrote that it had been his fate to be the antagonist of a man for whom even then I had the highest respect. Once, during his not infrequent stays in jail, Gandhi had prepared a pair of sandals for Smuts, who recalled that there was no hatred and personal ill-feeling between them, and when the fight was over, there was the atmosphere in which a decent peace could be concluded. As later events were to show, Gandhi's work did not provide an enduring solution for the Indian problem in South Africa. What he did to South Africa was indeed less important than what South Africa did to him. It had not treated him kindly, but by drawing him into the vortex of its racial problem, it had provided him with the ideal setting in which his peculiar talents could unfold themselves. The religious quest. Gandhi's religious quest dated back to his childhood, the influence of his mother and of his home life in Porbandar and Erected, but it received a great impetus after his arrival in South Africa. His Quaker friends in Pretoria failed to convert him to Christianity, but they quickened his appetite for religious studies. He was fascinated by the writings of Leo Tolstoy on Christianity, read the Quran in translation, and delved into Hindu scriptures and philosophy. The study of comparative religion, talks with scholars, and his own reading of theological works brought him to the conclusion that all religions were true and yet every one of them was imperfect because they were interpreted with poor intellects, sometimes with poor hearts, and more often misinterpreted. Trimod Rajchandra, a brilliant young Jain philosopher who became Gandhi's spiritual mentor, convinced him of the subtlety and profundity of Hinduism, the religion of his birth. And it was the Bhagavad Gita, which Gandhi had first read in London, that became his spiritual dictionary, and exercised probably the greatest single influence on his life. Two Sanskrit words in the Gita particularly fascinated him. One was aparigraha, non-possession, which implies that people have to jettison the material goods that cramp the life of the spirit and to shake off the bonds of money and property. The other was samabhava, equability, which enjoins people to remain unruffled by pain or pleasure, victory or defeat, and to work without hope of success or fear of failure. Those were not merely counsels of perfection. In the civil case that had taken him to South Africa in 1893, he had persuaded the antagonists to settle their differences out of court. The true function of a lawyer seemed to him to unite parties riven asunder. He soon regarded his clients not as purchasers of his services but as friends. They consulted him not only on legal issues but on such matters as the best way of weaning a baby or balancing the family budget. When an associate protested that clients came even on Sundays, Gandhi replied, "A man in distress cannot have Sunday rest." Gandhi's legal earnings reached a peak figure of £5,000 a year, but he had little interest in money-making, and his savings were often sunk in his public activities. In Durban and later in Johannesburg, he kept an open table. His house was a virtual hostel for younger colleagues and political co-workers. This was something of an ordeal for his wife, without whose extraordinary patience, endurance, and self-effacement Gandhi could hardly have devoted himself to public causes. As he broke through the conventional bonds of family and property, their life tended to shade into a community life. Gandhi felt an irresistible attraction to a life of simplicity, manual labor, and austerity. In 1904, after reading John Ruskin's Unto This Last, a critique of capitalism, he set up a farm at Phoenix near Durban where he and his friends could live by the sweat of their brow. 6 years later, another colony grew up under Gandhi's fostering care near Johannesburg. It was named Tolstoy Farm for the Russian writer and moralist, whom Gandhi admired and corresponded with. Those two settlements were the precursors of the more famous ashrams, religious retreats, in India, at Sabarmati near Ahmedabad, and at Sevagram near Wardha. South Africa had not only prompted Gandhi to evolve a novel technique for political action but also transformed him into a leader of men by freeing him from bonds that make cowards of most men. Persons in power. The British classical scholar Gilbert Murray prophetically wrote about Gandhi in the Hibbert Journal in 1918. Gandhi decided to leave South Africa in the summer of 1914. Just before the outbreak of World War I, he and his family first went to London, where they remained for several months. Finally, they departed England in December, arriving in Bombay in early January 1915. The British attitude toward Gandhi was one of mingled admiration, amusement, bewilderment, suspicion, and resentment. Except for a tiny minority of Christian missionaries and radical socialists, the British tended to see him at best as a utopian visionary and at worst as a cunning hypocrite whose professions of friendship for the British race were a mask for subversion of the British Raj. Gandhi was conscious of the existence of that wall of prejudice, and it was part of the strategy of satyagraha to penetrate it. His three major campaigns in 1920-22, 1930-34, and 1940-42 were well designed to engender that process of self-doubt and questioning that was to undermine the moral defenses of his adversaries and to contribute, together with the objective realities of the post-war world, to producing the grant of dominion status in 1947. The British abdication in India was the first step in the liquidation of the British Empire on the continents of Asia and Africa. Gandhi's image as a rebel and enemy died hard, but, as it had done to the memory of George Washington, Britain, in 1969, the centenary year of Gandhi's birth, erected a statue to his memory. Gandhi had critics in his own country and indeed in his own party. The liberal leaders protested that he was going too fast. The young radicals complained that he was not going fast enough. Left-wing politicians alleged that he was not serious about evicting the British or liquidating such vested Indian interests as princes and landlords. The leaders of the Dalits doubted his good faith as a social reformer, and Muslim leaders accused him of partiality to his own community. Research in the second half of the 20th century established Gandhi's role as a great mediator and reconciler. His talents in that direction were applied to conflicts between the older moderate politicians and the young radicals, the political terrorists and the parliamentarians, the urban intelligentsia and the rural masses, the traditionalists and the modernists, the caste Hindus and the Dalits, the Hindus and the Muslims, and the Indians and the British. It was inevitable that Gandhi's role as a political leader should loom larger in the public imagination, but the mainspring of his life lay in religion, not in politics. And religion for him did not mean formalism, dogma, ritual, or sectarianism. What I have been striving and pining to achieve these 30 years, he wrote in his autobiography, is to see God face to face. His deepest strivings were spiritual, but unlike many of his fellow Indians with such aspirations, he did not retire to a cave in the Himalayas to meditate on the absolute. He carried his cave, as he once said, within him. For him, truth was not something to be discovered in the privacy of one's personal life. It had to be upheld in the challenging contexts of social and political life. Gandhi won the affection and loyalty of gifted men and women, old and young, with vastly dissimilar talents and temperaments, of Europeans of every religious persuasion, and of Indians of almost every political line. Few of his political colleagues went all the way with him and accepted nonviolence as a creed. Fewer still shared his food fads, his interest in mud packs and nature cure, or his prescription of brahmacharya, complete renunciation of the pleasures of the flesh. Gandhi's ideas on sex may now sound quaint and unscientific. His marriage at the age of 13 seems to have complicated his attitude towards sex and charged it with feelings of guilt, but it is important to remember that total sublimation, according to one tradition of Hindu thought, is indispensable for those who seek self-realization, and brahmacharya was for Gandhi part of a larger discipline in food, sleep, thought, prayer, and daily activity designed to equip himself for service of the causes to which he was totally committed. What he failed to see was that his own unique experience was no guide for the common man. Scholars have continued to judge Gandhi's place in history. He was the catalyst, if not the initiator, of three of the major revolutions of the 20th century: the movements against colonialism, racism, and violence. He wrote copiously. The collected edition of his writings had reached 100 volumes by the early 21st century. Much of what he wrote was in response to the needs of his co-workers and disciples and the exigencies of the political situation, but on fundamentals he maintained a remarkable consistency, as is evident from the Hind Swaraj, Indian Home Rule, published in South Africa in 1909. The strictures on Western materialism and colonialism, the reservations about industrialism and urbanization, the distrust of the modern state, and the total rejection of violence that was expressed in that book seemed romantic, if not reactionary, to the pre-World War I generation in India and the West, which had not known the shocks of two global wars or experienced the phenomenon of Adolf Hitler and the trauma of the atom bomb. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's objective of promoting a just and egalitarian order at home and non-alignment with military blocs abroad doubtless owed much to Gandhi, but neither he nor his colleagues in the Indian nationalist movement wholly accepted the Gandhian models in politics and economics. In the years since Gandhi's death, his name has been invoked by the organizers of numerous demonstrations and movements. However, with a few outstanding exceptions, such as those of his disciple the land reformer Vinoba Bhave in India and of the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, those movements have been a travesty of the ideas of Gandhi. Yet Gandhi will probably never lack champions. Erik H. Erikson, a distinguished American psychoanalyst, in his study of Gandhi senses an affinity between Gandhi's truth and the insights of modern psychology. One of the greatest admirers of Gandhi was Albert Einstein, who saw in Gandhi's non-violence a possible antidote to the massive violence unleashed by the fission of the atom. And Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist, after his survey of the socio-economic problems of the underdeveloped world, pronounced Gandhi, in practically all fields, an enlightened liberal. In a time of deepening crisis in the underdeveloped world, of social malaise in the affluent societies, of the shadow of unbridled technology and the precarious peace of nuclear terror, it seems likely that Gandhi's ideas and techniques will become increasingly relevant.